Incarnate adapters are one of Warframe's best ideas ever created, and I want to talk about why I love them so much, and hopefully make you think more about them and appreciate them just a bit more. This video is also a precursor to a video I have in progress where I make 3 new Incarnate adapters from scratch using a lot of the content and brain work in this video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed, like and sub all that, it supports the channel, and I appreciate you guys a whole bunch, love you lots, let's get to it. So why do incarnate adapters exist in the first place? Incarnate adapters were meant to solve a complex problem at a smaller scale. Power creep. Basically, DE and Warframe learned more, created more, and in that process, weapons from an older era fell by the wayside. Weapons needed both stat and mechanic updates if they were meant to exist properly post the new steel path, as builds were placed under a lot more scrutiny. There is a fundamental truth in a lot of games, but it's particularly true in the modding space of Warframe. You cannot escape base stats. Mods are only as useful as the base stats allow them to be, and a lot of the older weapons were just designed outright weaker, as they were acquired earlier, designed earlier. There's just a lot of issues going on. These weapons are from a bygone era. Incarnate adapters aim to fix that, and for the first time giving a weapon outright base damage without a change in the patch notes, right? That's kind of the boring way to do it, but Incarnants are just so much more interesting. Additionally, Incarnants involve a form swap, meaning as the game became more of a horde shooter, the game has changed a lot for better, for worse. That's a long conversation that isn't really in like the substance of this video, but weapons that had fallen by the wayside due to single target natures were given mechanics to kind of help them compete when swapped into incarnate forms, but that still preserved their main form, which still got the stat buffs, right? This was helpful because there's really cool weapons like the Boltor, right? For me, the Boltor was probably one of my first primary weapons as a new player 8-9 years ago. Pinning enemies to walls was super fun. The sound design was super good. I love the way it looked. It's a neat gimmick that a player might want to keep. But when that player gets to Steel Path, or even like some higher end star chart, the weapon would just kind of lose its viability, which felt really bad because you kind of do grow attached to these weapons. I remember like the Vasto was the first one. I spent my starter 50 plat on rushing the Vasto. That was stupid, but it was a little more viable because it was like 8 years ago. So yeah, people get attached to weapons, I think, and just having an option to kind of keep that weapon on you while changing what it is fundamentally so that it can keep up with the meta, I think is really important. I really do think Incarnons are a masterpiece because even acquisition of them is actually like fairly compelling as a process. In a grindy game like Warframe, how a new piece of content is acquired shares importance with the piece of content itself, right? How that content feels to do, and then that, the content being the reward, right? And I think that Incarnate adapters really succeed here as well. Incarnate adapters are grinded from the Steel Path circuit. Now, circuit is one of my favorite game modes and overall additions to the game, so call me biased, right? I think it's really exciting. I think it gives newer players off the Steel Path kind of the opportunity to see how it feels to be really broken. Like, you get a couple good degrees rolling and you're just super busted, and I think that new players need a taste of that. So if that comes from circuit or from the actual main star chart, that's one or the other. But the early game of Warframe is fairly easy, right? For any player with any kind of modding sense, aim, mechanics, understanding, whatever. But a weapon like the Breton, even if, especially back in the day, if modded perfectly, simply just gets shafted up against the Steel Path barrier, which most players hit at 100 miles per hour randomly, because players do try to speedrun to the Steel Path, at least from my experience with new players, for the increased overall rewards. It's just a huge time efficiency bonus. But the truth is that a lot of players just don't have the strength to meet Steel Path where it's at. But as information is becoming more available, it's a little bit of a different story. I think players are getting a lot better on average, and so Steel Path, they're able to kind of meet there, even though Warframe is a really hard game. Incarnate adapters are acquired once that path is unlocked, meaning players can grind the circuit, which is pretty easy and fun, pop the adapter on after some quick degree farming, and go ahead and clear the Steel Path using the Steel Path with their new tool, which is really great. This means that weapons are essentially able to grow with the players, which is always an amazing feeling. The weapons I grew up using are able to become stronger and more unique once given incarnate forms, both in stats and in mechanics. Again, this isn't just a straight buff in the patch notes. It's something to be worked for, spec'd into, which we'll talk about in a second, that feels incredibly rewarding. It just comes in at just the right time, it feels like. Say for me, my example, I was able to, clear the early star chart with the Vasto. I love little hand cannons. I love revolvers. I think they're amazing. Fun aesthetic. Everyone kind of has their thing they like in these FPS games. Third person in this case. The player, myself, can get it upgraded fairly easily for the Steel Path and keep it use it as long as I want. But that's not really it, right? They can also decide how they want to use it, because the Incarnon form is really compelling, and some of the skill tree stuff, which we'll talk about in a second, is really compelling and allows you to use the weapon in various ways as you grow as a player, which means it's the complete opposite of stale. There is just so much to these weapons that I think is really exciting, and obviously there's a lot of variance between Incarnon adapters and certain weapons, but most of them are just super compelling, and I want to kind of talk about that design approach. On top of the unique firing modes and bonus stats, each Incarnon has an unlockable skill tree that yields a lot of the benefits and can be changed anytime from the arsenal. This is where a lot of the genius of Incarnons comes from. Not only do you get a stronger and potentially unique Incarnon form, but also the skill tree that determines kind of how you want to use the weapon. The unique form and skill tree ask you questions on how you want to use the weapon, and there isn't really a wrong answer here. Warframe excels when asking players questions because there's really never wrong answers, as even though modding is a fairly complex system, with that complexity comes variety and excitement and novelty to those who understand it in depth. Additionally, you have to remember that a lot of these stat benefits exist, most of them, exist outside of the Incarnon form as well, giving even more options, meaning you can, with this Vasto, for example here, I can never change the form, and I still get a ton of benefits. The Vasto Incarnon is my favorite in the game, and I'll be using it for our case study today. The Vasto's upgrades give it competent stats, but asks a ton of questions along the way. Firstly, the form swap changes the firing mode from its normal firing mode like a hand cannon to a 6-round fanning of the hammer, dealing immense single target damage, but the magazine only holds 4 bursts of said firing mode before needing to build, charge, and swap again, which is a pretty big DPS decrease, and it's like pretty annoying to do constantly. So the Vasto is really different than a lot of the other Incarnons, which we'll talk about in a second, but note that the buffs exist outside of the Incarnon form, meaning you can make the decision on how you want to use the form, if at all. Look at the skill tree, there's even more options and more questions that, the gun's kind of asking and that we have to answer. Usually the skill trees run in a fairly similar pattern, like this is usually the general upgrade versus niche stronger upgrade. This is usually the quality of life slot in the second slot here, and usually the third option contains the strongest. There's a lot of big upgrade choices here of varying quality and diversity, but I'm going to run through them and kind of explain how I feel about them, especially because this is, again, my favorite Incarnon. For our first slot, we have the pretty compelling choice of Lone Gun versus Death Trap Trigger, and the question here is kind of like, do we want to use this as a sidearm or a main weapon? Lone Gun increases our base damage normally, as does Death Trap Trigger. These both just give the base stat increase, which is where they come from, but this Lone Gun asks us to take no primary at all, but it increases the base damage by quite a bit more, and increases the base mag capacity by quite a bit more. So this is basically meant to be kept as a hand cannon, while Death Trap Trigger here achieves the opposite, increasing that base damage, but on equipping from the primary weapon, again using this as a sidearm, it increases the base critical chance by a large 30%, and the base critical multiplier by a 0.8x. But only for 3 seconds, which means this is clearly meant to be pulled out, blasting the Eximus's, shits move off, and then putting back away. These are both really compelling options, but they ask the question, how do you want to use it? And I can just, every mission I could change this if I really wanted to, but I think that's really, really compelling design. When it comes to the quality of life slot, it's actually one of the most underrated things, I think, because modding in Warframe is a very tight process. You get 8 mod slots, and then the Excellent slot can have some QOL stuff, and usually that's what it does, but sometimes you can't even have that. So having in kind of like quality of life slot, even though it's generally just less interesting, like minus recoil if you want it personally, not for me. I love the kick of the Vasto. It's like one of my favorite things. It's very, very good vibes, and the only thing more important than math in Warframe is vibes. So not really for me. The base mag cap is super useful for like charging Incarnon, and then again, Awakened Readiness here, which reloads some of the magazine while you have it holstered. It lends itself to that sidearm kind of playstyle. Minus recoil is definitely more for the it's quality of life, works in both forms, but it's just good if you generally. And then base mag cap, this kind of lends itself to the main firing, using it as your main source of DPS. Now the third one is generally a little less, it's either the most interesting or the least interesting. Just bunch of base stats, like a 1 gazillion base stats, and I'll never complain about these. I think that, it still is decently like exciting in terms of how you want to mod, but I think Reaper's Plenty here is just the most compelling one. It basically just says, hey, if you're landing your headshots, just have infinite ammo. just have 100% ammo efficiency for 2 seconds every headshot you land, which means if you are not missing headshots, you just have infinite ammo, which obviously definitely 100 zillion% lends it to that kind of hand cannon main DPS source function. I just think that they needed to tag a little bit of damage here, not nearly as much as like a Survivor's Edge or a Commodore's Fortune, but definitely some base crit chance or something, or maybe like a deadhead like multiplier needed to be applied here to make Reaper's Plenty kind of more exciting to take. But this is kind of the exciting stuff that I like. Again, there are multiple things here that like let you spec into the weapon that you want this to be, and everyone's Vasto is going to be different. I think that it's a little more exciting when you mod the way that you find compelling, and the more variety, the more excitement you get from kind of having a weapon that is your own. That's kind of one of the things I leverage. I'm not a huge Riven mod fan, but I think Riven mods are exciting because they allow you to create a weapon that is truly unique in a game where everyone can realistically just have the same build, which isn't very exciting in my opinion. This allows you to kind of express yourself in a more unique way, and also again, change it all the time based on the build you're using, based on the playstyle, based on the a new frame you've acquired, right? Some builds will lend itself to that lone gun playstyle, and some want Death Trap Trigger to be used as a sidearm, right? I think this is very exciting, and this is just really good design in my opinion. Incarnons are pretty basic in terms of operation. Basically, charge them with headshots for the guns, alt fire to swap forms. Hit 6x melee or greater and heavy attack for the melee. Guns get an Incarnon magazine that scales with how much meter they swap forms at, and melees get 3 minutes of the buffed form. There's a bit of work involved, but basically every single Incarnon has a fairly active process in order to keep them up and running, except for you, Torrid. This feels simple, rewarding, and engaging, as opposed to just a straight up stat buff with the patch notes. Again, I mentioned that. I think that's a lame way to do it. This is just so much more compelling. In my view, there are two main Incarnon types, and be mindful, this is my own terminology, not really used by DE themselves. Uptime Incarnons. Uptime Incarnons are Incarnons that really only do their best work in their Incarnon form, and any time spent outside of the form is spent charging that form back up. This is usually due to a unique mechanic added to the Incarnon form that helps fix the weapon, or some stats that are too good to give up. For example, the Sybaris' Incarnon form basically just gives a straight up blast upgrade, meaning you want it up as often as possible, and same kind of with a Torrid becoming a beam weapon. These I find to be like less exciting Incarnons, but it's very much, in my view, a necessary evil, because the weapon that they are trying to buff, like the Braton, I used an example way earlier, it's just not going to be able to keep up in its base form almost no matter what you do to it. So that additional mechanic in the Incarnon form is basically required, and thankfully, you know, these usually have fairly big mag sizes, which means that even though you can blow through the Incarnon like fairly quickly, you get enough time in it to the point where you're not like giving yourself arthritis hitting that middle mouse button or whatever it is on controller over and over. Overall, these are the less interesting ones, but definitely like I still enjoy, you know, I find myself using them very often. Situational Incarnons are my favorite, and the Incarnons that usually stay in their base form or have certain context that lets the player make a decision on which to use. Again, we're talking about like decisions here, right? So we have the decision of which form do we want to use, which skill tree specs we want to use, what build we want to use. I think that's all very exciting, and all of it can, some of it can be done in mission, some of it can be done in the arsenal, and that's just really good stuff in my opinion. The best example for me is the Atomos. The beam just generally feels better than the Mega Man Explosive Blaster, but there are situations where more raw damage of the Incarnon is better, and in most cases, you get to make that choice. Again, you can make the choice in the modding menu or literally in mission. That is just a very exciting piece of design that I like a lot. You know, the Mega Man Buster Shot might be more exciting when you use the Atomos as a sidearm, as opposed to using the Slag Beam Cannon if you're using it as your main weapon. I think it's really exciting. So you have like a status capped enemy that just would benefit from taking more raw damage. In that case, the Mega Man Buster Shot might just be better. No Incarnon design is straight up better than another. I would say that some of the niche traits could have their like horizons broadened a bit, whether in terms of like conditions of triggering or like options in the skill tree. But overall, I love this system so much. So why am I making this video? This video is ultimately just a love letter to the system because I like to complain a lot, and so having something more positive just acts as a way to yap about what I want more of from the game. Also, it's to promote my own video about my own custom Incarnons I'm making, but Incarnons are just, they're incredibly versatile, involved entities that make old content feel up to snuff, and it really represents what DE is doing when they're at their absolute best. Making these weapons essentially timeless, adding new ones. I really hope they explore Incarnon conditions, which is something I'll be doing in a future video. Again, little shameless plug there. The recent event made me feel out my frustrations with content islands, and Incarnons just, they have every right to be Zeraman slop, tied purely to the Zeraman, but instead, they're a very involved design, unlocking the skill tree, structuring that skill tree to your liking, farming the weapon in the first place, farming the Incarnon materials, leveling, all that good stuff. Warframe is at its best when as much of it sits interconnected as possible with a player's progression. That's why content islands are so frustrating. It feels like you're playing multiple different games instead of one united experience, which is incredibly frustrating. I get Warframe's a large game, but ultimately just a little bit of connection when it comes to these content islands would be so helpful and much less frustrating. I don't expect every future piece of content to be nearly as good as Incarnons, but I want this video to serve as a reminder that sometimes it's a good idea to return to form and do the fundamentals very right, so you can create another mechanic as good as this. You put in a ton of work to get an Incarnon across multiple farms, circuit, to view your experience unlocking the steel path in the first place and playing the circuit in the first place. But the reward is something you can treasure and use forever. It's not just a new thing, right? It brings up your old weapons. It's not only connected in terms of width, but in terms of like depth. You know, you acquired your first Vasto Prime, Lord knows when. It became unviable after you hit Steel Path, but now you get to, you know, there's more to it, right? There's more to farm, and it's all linear. It's not just, oh, time to farm this. No, like this was a, you know, it's like a story, right? Incarnons kind of paint out a story. The farm is not only deep, it is also wide. And I think that's just a really good piece of design, and I think it's something that D and Warframe should continue to pursue. The only real issues I have with Incarnons, Lion power creep, which is kind of whatever. Like at this point, I've totally learned to embrace it, and I think that there's a lot of appeal to it. My main beef, actually, I guess more accurately, resides with Riven disposition, which I will yap about for just a bit. Rivens and Incarnons basically like collided with each other at like Mach 1 zillion, and weapons that were initially weak, like Dual Toxicist and Torrid, got these insane buffs that make them feel so strong, and it's really for no reason of their own. It's just like these external amplifiers in the forms of the Incarnons and the Riven, and they just kind of come together. And I'm not really opposed to these weapons, right? But it's followed up by like this really inconsistent balancing for weapons that I want to be strong, like the Purgator, and like other new weapons that come out with a really bad dispo. It's really frustrating because the Torrid's allowed to exist in its current state, and like that's fine, but I want like my other cool weapons to feel like just as strong, right? Again, Riven dispo is like a whole nightmare, and I'm sure it's just like one intern who like spends an hour a month, you know, balancing the dispos, but that's really my main beef. I think more Incarnons, as soon as enough Incarnons come out, like we will have such insane weapon diversity, and there already is such insane weapon diversity. And I just think this design is like really compelling, and I hope that again more gets kind of looked into. The one thing my video will be looking into is actually more central to conditions on proccing the Incarnon. I won't spoil too much, but I am really excited to talk about that. So yeah, hopefully you guys just enjoyed this yapping piece. I think the next video coming up will be a Warframe guide. Yeah, love you guys lots. Thank you so much for listening to me running my mouth as usual, and I'll see you in the next one. Much love. Talk to you soon. Bye bye.